I lost it. They were also, going to help in recovering people who were runaways. Like they would get word there's a blonde 15-year-old kid who's running around, see if you can find him, and then if they found him, they try to get him to go back home. And then also work with these folks who were having, who were kind of having problems with their life on the street. But from what I read, and maybe I'm being unfair to them, it seems like they got very caught up in that first part about prevention, and they didn't quite get to the other part about reaching out and helping out. And young pastors would come, and from what I'm reading from minutes of meetings, these young pastors would come and get really caught up in the outreach and trying to help. And then at the next meeting, they suddenly weren't there anymore. They suddenly disappeared. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't sure if Pastor Eckhart was getting rid of them because he really wanted them to focus. I'm not sure. I should be fair to him. But this was a very important part of their ministry in the late 60s and early 70s before Pastor Eckhart then took a call at another congregation. Those are the first 100 years. It's a little harder, and I'm just going to be honest with you, it's a little harder to talk about the last 58 years, 59, coming on 59 years. Not 59, that's right, come on, 60. St. John's, maybe for those of you who know in the neighborhood, has gone through some difficult times. After Pastor Eckhart left, Pastor Browse came, but Pastor Browse was only called as a part-time pastor. And so when you have a part-time person, and that was over a good period of time, from 75 till about 98, not as much gets done. And I think St. John started to become very much more looking inward than looking outward. And as a faith community, I think that that's always dangerous. And so that continued on. But then a significant thing happened at the turn of the century is Pastor Eckhart's daughter, who was raised in the congregation, Freddie, her father's name was Fred, and she was Freddie, was called to be here. And it seemed like, okay, they're going to have a pastor again, somebody who knows the church, somebody who can bring some new life into it. And she tried to, but she got sabotaged. And she was quickly it was very difficult. It was made difficult for her to stay here. And so she left. And then there was an interim pastor here for a while, and then I came about 3 years ago. So just to be honest with you about our history, when I came about 3 years ago, I considered my job basically restarting, almost starting from scratch. We're starting, in a sense, it's almost a new congregation. Most of the people who are here now have joined within the last 2 years. Some of the comments that I heard were just made me laugh. My husband and I were out front one day, and a guy came up and said, "Oh, are you the two who bought the church?" Some of you know that Tony and Tina's wedding was here. A lot of people thought that it only existed for Tony and Tina's wedding. They didn't realize there was still an existing congregation here. And so for the 3 years that I've been here, I've been trying, working very hard to change the community's image of St. John's. And it's one of the reasons, I'll say it honestly, that one of the reasons when Ted put out the call, I said, yes, I wanted to be able to tell people St. John's story, because it's a wonderful story and it's a resurrecting story. And so I'm always eager to welcome people in. We are connecting now with other organizations that are serving the community in a variety of ways. I don't know if you've noticed, but every morning I come out and I make sure the gates are open, because I know that the fence itself was very controversial when it went up, and some people see it as very foreboding. And so at least, if I can't take the fence down, at least I can open the gates up and allow people to gain access to a place that the community should have access to. So that's kind of the background and why St. John's is here. I think I can also honestly say that the Germans who founded this congregation would be outraged by the pastor who was standing before you. They wouldn't understand. But then again, our understanding of ourselves changes. And so right now, our congregation refers to ourselves as a diverse community of faith. And that's what we are. It's very interesting, the evolution that has happened. When the Germans were here, it was a very homogeneous congregation. They were even afraid to start having English-speaking programs, right? And now everybody who sits in our pews represents a different demographic. And that certainly is, to me, what church is about today. So what we believe is still foundational. It's still all the same. How we express it has certainly changed over the years. And I hope this kind of little walkthrough has given you a little bit of an understanding about what life here at St. John's has been over the last 159 years. I'm going to make a plug for the next 6 years. All right, starting tonight, you're the first ones to have my plug. All right, we have some major anniversaries coming up. So next year will be the 160th anniversary of the congregation, and then in 2017 is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, which the Lutheran Church is already starting to get excited about. And if you think we're shy, just wait till you see us celebrate 500th anniversary of Luther starting the movement. Then, of course, for this neighborhood in 2018 will be the 160th anniversary of coming into this building. In 2019 is, of course, Stonewall 50, and we become very involved with Heritage and Pride and working with them in the annual Pride celebration. So we'll have Stonewall 50, and then the big one, 2021, the building will celebrate 200 years of being a worshiping space. So we've got 6 years of a lot of partying going on. So I hope you will watch what's going on here. I'm looking forward to some wonderful special events because I love history and because I love acknowledging and celebrating the past and talking about it because it certainly helps us understand our present right now. So yes?
I have a question. You mentioned the word synod, S-N-Y-O-D, is that correct? And I'm not sure I understood what the meaning of it.
Sure. Synod, the synod is a geographical area that we group the national church into. So if you think of the national government has the 50 states, our national church has 65 geographical areas called synods. All right. In Roman Catholic Church, we call them dioceses. In the Episcopal Church, we call them dioceses. For Lutherans, we refer to the word synod, which means walking together. And so it's the congregation. So it's those in this geographical area.
It reminds me of another word, which has nothing to do with it. It's synagogue. It looks like that. Did that word name come? Did synagogue come from
Well,
that?
the sin, the S-Y-N, not the S-I-N, but the S-Y-N, is together. And right? Because I think the synagogue comes out of the Greek term for meeting together, a place where there's a meeting together. So the sin part definitely is from the Greek origins. Yeah.
The name St. John's.
Yes.
Is this the same St. John the Baptist?
No. Some churches would be named St. John the Baptist because that's a separate John. When you get up, and again, sorry for the screen blocking the window, but the figures in this window back here, the one over on this side is St. John, and he's got an eagle by him. And St. John, the Gospel writer, is given the symbol of the eagle. So the fact that the eagle is there with St. John tells us that they named it St. John, meaning St. John, the one who wrote the Gospel. The figure on the other end is St. Paul, and it's kind of always a little embarrassing that we have Jesus in the middle, who's a blonde Jesus. You can tell they were Germans, right? They had to make him blonde. Of course, Jesus is coming from the Middle East. Probably really didn't look like that. But again, it's an interesting take on how we culturally project ourselves and stuff.
I have another question.
Yeah.
The church now, with the synod, is looking forward to Catholic priests
Yeah,
on
sure.
homosexuality and what have you. I'm sure it exists in all the synods, but do you foresee that the Catholic priest will have it?
Again, the Pope isn't out. I mean, we hold the Pope as just another bishop. You know, as Lutherans, we don't follow. Yeah, but I think it is a matter of time before it's going to happen. Whether it happens in this Pope's lifetime or whether it's a future Pope, but I think at some point they're going to have to, because you know, and the history of Popes not being allowed to marry, when you look back at it, it's really
It's a man-made thing.
well, totally man-made and more connected to property and economics back in the feudal period than it is about some spiritual idea. So I think in the progressive moves that they're making, yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see just how. Ted, yeah.
Well, I want to put you on the spot for a minute. I want to ask you if you wouldn't mind speaking for a few minutes about this being June, this being Pride Month,
Yeah.
and you being a church on Christopher Street. When you were looking at the history of the church, did you discover or come across any bumps in the road? Was there any watershed moment when the church finally embraced the LGBT community or became, obviously now you're part of Pride March, right? You have the rainbow flag and everything. But
Right.
was there a time when, you know, initially when the Pride March started to grow and become this big celebration of the church, I imagine maybe whoever was in charge of the church at the time may have been a little resistant. And
Yeah.
then did you uncover any?
You know, the confusing, once again, sometimes we're just too shy for our own good and we don't get the word out. There is, there's documentation, and what I came across is that they had services, like around Pride, you know, and supposedly welcoming in. But I almost wanted to say, did you tell anybody? Because it didn't seem like it went anywhere. And so I'm not sure how much, and the congregation was quite small at the time. So as St. John's did become more accepting, but the community just didn't know about it. And so certainly I've been, part of my philosophy and my practice of ministry is to be far more intentional in terms of welcoming people in, welcoming groups in. Last night this place was filled with people who will be taking part in the Pride March, and it was orientation for the Pride March. I mean, that's how you get the word out, is by getting people in, right? And so there were attempts to reach out to the neighborhood, but I'm not sure if the neighborhood ever knew about them. So, somebody over here. Yeah.
People don't know it, but more Americans alive today are descendant from German immigrants than from any other nationality. But my question is, do you ever get, for Sunday services, tourists from around the United States or from Germany?
Yes. Yeah, and especially if not on Sunday morning, we got anytime we open the doors, we can guarantee that people will that we'll get tourists stopping in. And I love it when they're German, because I like to say, hey, look, there's German text in the windows. And they're like, and again, because the immigrant church experience is so American that a European coming over this is like foreign to them, no pun intended. This is foreign to them that, you know, that churches are established around language and around cultural groups, because of course they're dealing with state churches, and you know, you're a Swede and therefore you're a Lutheran kind of thing. So, it's always fun to have people coming in, but yeah. And I also, you know, we also get Europeans coming in. We were doing a jazz service for a while, and we'd have Italians coming in who would be like, oh my goodness, you know, you should do this over in Italy, because, you know, this is so different from what our worship style is and stuff. So I love it when people jump in. There's so many hands. I'm going to try to kind of move around different places, and I'll be back.
I have a couple questions. First of all, you mentioned the German language services. When did those end?
I think they still had them well into the, like even maybe the 30s and 40s. That even though they maybe predominantly were an English-speaking congregation at that time, they still, for the sake of some of the older folks, kept it going.
And then also, I know in the city some German companies with German heritages try to distance themselves from Germany during World War I. Did you see any evidence of that in this church?
You know, I was looking at that, and I want to dig deeper into that. I tell you, I'm so thankful for the people at the 50-year mark, for the history that they wrote while it was still fresh in their minds. I mean, it's this great little book, and they really go into, you think I went into detail. They went into such detail, you know, how much was taken for this offering at this event and things like that. So I'm really thankful for that, but so I have to do a little more weeding through other kinds of primary documents to really search that out. Yeah, it's always an interesting story how Germans were treated and how they treated themselves, how they tried to kind of quiet down their German heritage. And I'm sure some of that was going on because they still saw themselves as a German congregation. So, good question. Yeah, Peter.
Taking another page from history, if this was more or less a German-speaking congregation during World War II, like mosques were investigated after 9/11, was this church or any members investigated during World War II? Any sympathies or such?
Not that I find any evidence of. And I think by World War II, it was far enough away. It would have been, probably anything would have more been with World War I, because they were still strongly connected as being German. I mean, Pastor Young, who is serving right up until 1914, had been born in Germany. I'm not sure about Oberlander, if he had been born in Germany or not. But certainly, I think, you know, by World War II, they're very much an American congregation at that point.
You know what happened to that building that isn't that?
And I'm so curious. They talk about it, you know, being at the back of the. I need to see a map and figure out. Maybe the backside of it was on West 10th, and so it was standing on those lots that now where the buildings that face West 10th are. I mean, that's what it looks like from that picture. It's a great question, but it seemed like it was a building that was starting to fall apart. And when they built the brick building next door in 1886, there's this sense of we really need a new education building. And they had tried to do some fixing up of the other one. And it's almost like, even in that picture, you can see that the artist kind of shows that it's a sad little wood building and probably going through some tough times. So, yeah.
A suggestion, you might be able to find it on Sanborn maps, which you can get up at the New York Historical Society for one. There
Yeah.
are probably other sources. But I have a question. I'm noting how far apart these pews are compared to most churches. Were there dealers or they were trapped?
You know, it's a good question, and I'm not sure. I don't, unless they had more pews, and at some point they got rid of some and they realigned them. I don't know.
The bottom seems to be longer, so they're...
Well, I know there were some of them.
All these pews there.
Right, there used to be pews up to here, but in terms of the space in between, that's what I wondered about. Big dresses and stuff. It may have been. We're also trying to figure out just when these pews went in. If, you know, because I look at the pictures, and certainly the pictures from like the 1905 and the 1915 period, it seems like these pews are already in. So I'm not sure. They may have been part of the 86 renovation. I can't imagine that they're the originals from 1821.
Why were these taken out?
These were taken out by the former pastor. I believe it was to create more space up in the front.
There used to be, there used to be wooden panels of the four evangelists on the wall there.
Yeah.
I was wondering why all of that had been changed, because that's a recent change, since 2006.
Yeah, it was all changed by the time I got here. And actually, I can't even find. I haven't seen it. Oh no, I did did see a picture, that's right, I did see a picture of what that, of what that looked
So
like.
I thought it would be the minutes from the council meetings, because they used to
And-
have them.
Sure, and there's so many minutes, I haven't read through them all.
That's part of the structural,
Yeah, and yet, as I mentioned, it's, the structure of this space, it has been changing, right? It's changed quite a bit over,
those two chairs used to be up.
yeah, well,
Facing
we,
each other, facing walls.
yeah, especially as a smaller congregation, now we move this altar down so that there's a more intimate feel at worship.
So you don't walk and kneel anymore on Sundays?
No, we actually gather in a circle and people really like that. And we've been setting up chairs for that and using it for smaller midweek services, kind of creating a chapel feel to it. And yeah.
And Pastor Krause was here until 2003.
Was it that?
2006, because I was here for those 6 years from 2000 to 2006.
Right.
I personally experienced.
Yeah, no, thanks. I did interview you and filled in some of the guys. I thought I saw stuff that she came in 2000. Was it 2000? She was 6 years, right? 3 years. Oh, I thought she was here 6. Oh, okay.
All the denominations are Protestants.
Yeah.
Are the Lutherans most closely aligned or most faithful to the teachings and vision of Martin?
Yes. His teachings and his understanding of how to interpret Scripture and how to are his foundation. We still kind of go back. Some people go back to it more religiously than others. Some people want to, say, okay, those are great ideas then, but times have changed in 500 years. But certainly, he is his theology and his interpretation and his method of interpreting, and it's not just we take everything that he said and that's it, but actually even in terms of issues, or social issues around sexuality and stuff, we try to say, okay, these are the principles. We don't just say, oh, this is the way it was in 1517, so this is the way it's always going to be. But what are the principles that were used then, and how do we use those principles now to look at contemporary understandings?
So with all the denominations of Protestantism, obviously,
Yeah.
do they vary on how close or how creative they got away from interpretations of Martin Luther?
Sure. Yeah, most of them will have him as at least a theologian, but certainly Calvin is another primary theologian. So the Presbyterians, Reformed Church, if it's called a Reformed Church, they're known as Calvinists. Okay, so they're holding Calvin as a primary. Now, Calvin and Luther agree on a lot of things, but they also maybe nuance things in different ways. Sometimes people will call that splitting hairs. But so Calvin is certainly, Calvin and Luther are the two primary foundational theologians, and then you have other people like Knox, but Knox is really becomes an intensifier of Calvin, and you have others, but those are the two primary ones.
Wasn't Calvin also extremely more severe and austere as a person and how you should live your life?
Yeah. Luther loved a good beer and a good laugh.
Exactly.